Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Dawson, and thanks for joining us for what will be an exciting conversation today on crisis management, resilience, learning, and change. We're going to have a sort of a conversation to start with, but I would encourage you, if you have questions, to put those questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those as soon as possible. We have a great panel today, including two of our wonderful faculty, Vineet Desai and Kovoor, both who have domain expertise around crisis management and change. And then we're really fortunate to have Bryan Leach with us as well, who's the founder of and the CEO of Ibotta, one of Denver's most exciting startups. And Bryan's been kind enough to join us while he's out on the road today and down in Arkansas. I do want to let you know that this will be recorded, and so recording will be available afterwards. So just to get started, let's maybe go around and have each of you do a little bit more of an introduction than I did. Talk about your current roles and how you got into your current work. You want to start, Bryan?
Sure. First of all, thanks for including me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to your questions and comments in our dialogue. I'm Bryan Leach. As Scott said, I'm the founder and CEO of Ibotta. Ibotta is a cashback rewards technology founded in 2011. We started out at 18th and Blake in the basement of an old 20th century fire station in Denver, paying $8 a month per square foot in rent. Things have changed since then. We have over 800 employees, and we've provided almost $1.5 billion in cashback rewards. We power cashback rewards for large retailers like Walmart, hence I'm in Bentonville, Arkansas. I previously was trained as a lawyer. I clerked for David Souter at the U.S. Supreme Court, moved out to Colorado to be a trial lawyer after my Supreme Court clerkship, practiced law for 4 years, became a partner in my law firm, built an international arbitration practice, had a quarter-life crisis, quit the law, and became an entrepreneur for the first time, raised the money from 51 angel investors and have made every mistake in the book and learned along the way. It's been almost 11 years in this new technology adventure. So pleased to be here and looking forward to learning from the panel.
Thanks, Bryan. What a wonderful career. Sarah?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Well, I started my journey with crisis management a long time ago in 1989 when I worked at the Center for Crisis Management at USC, University of Southern California. And since then, I have studied various forms of crises as an academic and as a scholar, and various facets of crises. I've also consulted with organizations in the chemical industry, with NASA, organizations in the online world, nonprofits, published a number of articles, written a book, Crisis Management, Resilience, and Change, that Michaela will put in the chat. And it's a topic I've been fascinated with. As we'll talk about, there's so many facets, the emotional issues, complexity in terms of understanding what is going on. And so it's kept me motivated all these years and still very fascinated in understanding this phenomenon.
Thank you, Sarah. Vinit?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for your interest in this topic. My name is Vineet Desai. I'm a professor of management here. I study failures and organizational learning. I've been here about 15 years, but prior to my academic career, I used to work for a major multinational professional services firm, and I worked in their litigation consulting practice. And so we would work on cases involving breaches of contract, embezzlement, fraud, securities litigation, and so on. And one of the things that always fascinated me from one case to the next was that these weren't necessarily bad people making bad decisions all the time. Instead, more often, it was people in bad situations or surrounded with ineffective structures or weak incentives or governance that in some cases allowed some of these decisions to percolate. And of course, working like we worked, we didn't have the luxury to take a step back and connect some of those dots across those cases. So instead, at some point, I decided to take a step back and go into grad school and study organizations a little bit more directly and learn why some of these types of failures occur and whether or not companies can learn and improve from them. And that's how I wound up in my current position.
Thanks, Vinit. Make me think of Edwards Deming, I think, who said that 95% of what happens in the system is the function of the system, not the people. So to get started, just make sure that we're talking about the same kinds of concepts here. Sarah, how do you define a crisis?
So I'd like to define a crisis as an event or a situation that's a threat to the survival or goals of an organization. So we're talking about not just problems or challenges, but very serious events that have consequences for organizations. There are also many forms of crises. So, we have economic crises like a bankruptcy. We can have technological disasters, an airline crash, oil spill, like British Petroleum. We can have scandals that affect the reputation of the organization, like Wells Fargo, where they open fraudulent bank accounts, or Volkswagen, where they created a defeat device to address emission standards. So there are many forms, school shootings, and it's important to understand that there are a range of events because their causes are different and there are different consequences for each of these events. And also something to keep in mind as we discuss, the size of the organization and the resources an organization has also affects the experience of a crisis. So for a startup, it's a very different experience, and they are often in a threat mode because they're fighting for their survival, while a large company has more slack and resources to buffer themselves from a crisis. It's also important to realize that multiple crises may be going on in a situation. You may be fighting an oil spill, but you're also fighting threats to your brand. So, or there's a human and social, if people are, injured or killed. So the crises are complex events with many different facets.
Thank you, Sarah. And Vinit, how do you think about failures?
Yeah, so I study failures, and they're a broader class of events than crises, and that failures can be both big and small. They don't necessarily have to kind of escalate, although they can and sometimes do. And I tend to understand failures as kind of anything bad that happens in or around organizations. But in the research literature, they've been conceptualized more precisely as a performance shortfall relative to targets or aspirations for desirable performance. And one of the interesting things is that those targets move around. And so what was a success in this quarter or this year might very well wind up being a failure in the next year. And that leads to some interesting dynamics. This involves performance, kind of like Sarah was talking about, on a variety of metrics. So sure, profitability matters, reputation and brand, but also things like product safety, quality, reliability, environmental emissions, in the healthcare context, mortality, time to treat. And these types of failures oftentimes, although unfortunate, give rise to some interesting opportunities to learn some new information about how to do things better in our companies. But not all organizations are poised to pick up on those lessons. And when we get a little bit deeper into the panel session, I'll talk about some of the reasons why that's the case.
Great, thank you. And Bryan, how about talking about a major crisis or failure that you've had as a founder and how the organization and you sort of adapted and learned?
Yeah, there's a crisis on a everyday basis when you're a startup founder. Starting before you even start the company, in the process of looking for fundraising, I couldn't find a single venture capital fund that wanted to put money into my company. I probably spoke to 15 or 20 of them. That's not how I had it playing out in my mind's eye. So immediately you're set shifting. Okay, am I going to stay with my current career, or am I going to find some other path forward that allows me to pursue this idea? In my case, that meant going to my friends and family and finding 51 individual angel investors, each writing a $25,000 or $30,000 check, which is not the way anybody kind of talks about the ideal way to do things. And then once you have your company, almost every single day, there's something going wrong. I mean, we've faced a surprise lawsuit for $500 million about 6 months into the company, which would have put us out of business had it had any merit, which was a shock and oh my goodness, how embarrassing. We're all going to die here on the kind of right on the first 6 months of the company, all the way out to where we are right now, where you find out a competitor has done this or that, and it threatens your entire market, or the entire capital market collapses for tech IPOs, or there's a pandemic and everybody all 800 people have to start working at home overnight with no prior connectivity or experience as a remote company. So if you don't like failure and crisis, you should stick to a different profession.
So what have you learned about yourself, and how's the organization learned and changed as a result of these crises?
I will say the more crises you go through, the more you develop kind of a capacity to handle them with a little bit of emotional resiliency and equanimity. It's never easy. You always feel a sort of pit in your stomach as one emerges. But, you learn empirically. I will probably find a way around this somehow, even if I cannot see what that solution is at this moment. I like to joke that, my wife and I literally have a restaurant in Denver that is set aside for us to go to whenever we need to have the conversation, which we're all going to die and be out of business, and what would we do if I didn't any longer have a salary from Ibotta? And she'll say, "How was your day?" And I'll say, "Oh man, this, that, and the other happened." She said, "I'll go ahead and get a reservation at North and Cherry Creek." And even just being in that restaurant reminds me that we've been in this restaurant 6-7 times before, and we always seem to find a way to survive. So I think it's just kind of calming down the anxiety that you feel, and so you can think clearly through that situation, and then show up in a place where your energy is reaffirming and calming for the other people in your leadership team and throughout your organization.
Great, thank you for that. So Sarah, what are the most crucial steps that a company needs to take when they're facing a crisis, a pandemic, or a variety of the many crises that Bryan just talked about?
So it's important to understand the context in which you are operating. So as Bryan talked about, the stakes are really high, and there's threat in the situation. There's uncertainty and ambiguity as to how the situation is going to evolve. So, and the uncertainty and ambiguity could pertain to in sudden events, like what happened? How did it happen? When exactly did it begin? Who are the key people who've been impacted? Who are the people we need to now respond to? So as Bryan mentioned, the first thing is to stay calm, because it's a highly emotional, stressful situation, is to stay calm and communicate control of the situation. And take responsibility for the containment of the situation if it's something that directly impacts your organization, but not for the cause of the situation, because we don't exactly know what caused it. A disgruntled employee came in and did something. We don't exactly know what caused it, but it is your responsibility to take control for containing the situation. It's also really important to bring to mind to all your employees and the people who are involved the core vision of your organization. And for crisis management, two facets are really important. One is we're going to handle it competently, and two, we're going to handle it with integrity. So we're not going to cut corners and do things that's going to escalate this crisis. So while you're doing that, you also have to start organizing and activating a response, your crisis management team, your top management team, and start delegating tasks. Then you also need to continually communicate with not only internal stakeholders, but external stakeholders of what you're doing, why you're doing it, any short-term wins where you've made progress, because you're trying to reduce uncertainty, and you're also trying to attract support towards the organization. And then finally, when there is some resolution that you can say, okay, the crisis stage is over, and now it's a challenge stage where we're trying to recover and address damage, it's important to do that. And I think as Vinit talked about, like failures, crises are very dynamic situations. So, and multiple stakeholders are trying to take control of the situation. So people are trying to make sense of what's happened, including the media, government agencies, the organization, and people are trying to fill the vacuum with the narrative to explain what exactly is going on. And in that process, people are going to define victims and perpetrators of the crisis. So it's very important for organizations to take control of that narrative, but do it competently and with integrity. So it's not, so you don't tarnish your brand and further escalate the crisis.
Thanks, Sarah. Does any of that resonate for you, Bryan?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's, you can understand it intellectually, but until you are in a few of them, you don't exactly know how you will respond. And I think that part of that is sort of your own tailored self-care regimen that is required to get you as quickly as possible to a place where you can make the kind of productive choices that Vinit and Sarah are talking about. And I think that is something I didn't really learn in graduate school or in my earlier part of my career. And I think you almost have to kind of look back on a few crises, do a few postmortems on, what you did or how you showed up in group settings, and then remind yourself actively as you're going through a next one, okay, I'm at risk of having this kind of behavior, that kind of behavior. So part of it is eliminating the natural bad instinctual reflexive reaction you're about to have, which is going to be very high stakes. And part of it is about doing a few proactive things. So, for instance, when we had to do the layoffs, we laid off about 85 people right after the pandemic. That was an obvious crisis moment. We've never laid anyone off. So we were able to really thoughtfully script that and how we wanted to do that and consistent with our values. And then fortunately, we were able to hire a lot of those people back. But that was really, we had time, maybe a week or two. But there are situations where we don't have time. We had a situation where we had someone threaten to kill a huge number of our employees, sending us photos of guns, threatening for it to be another Las Vegas style shooting. We had to get the federal authorities involved. That person is now serving a prison term in the Eastern District of New York. But that did not allow for a lot of time to plan. And we had to decide, how much information do we share with the company? We have to explain at least enough so they understand why we've got the building in a greater security lockdown, why we have a guard out in front of our door, but we don't want to spend so much time, freaking people out that they can't be productive in their jobs. So these are sometimes decisions you have an hour or two to make. So depending on what the situation is, you're going to have to develop different habits to make yourself to get yourself through those situations. And so, yes, I think you got to have a framework, which is what Sarah and Vinit are talking about. And then you got to have a little bit of practice to see how you personally respond.
Yes, Scott, if I can add to that, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think one needs to practice with the failures, with the challenges, and do a lot of, the leader has to be self-aware and understand who you are, who your team members are, how do they react under pressure? Because it's all about being able to handle pressure and to be able to be calm under pressure. And that requires a lot of practice, a lot of self-awareness, and developing emotional management skills, ability to pay attention when you're under pressure, not be scattered and just reactive. A lot of leaders make the mistake where they either go into denial when a crisis hits, or they just start reacting and then start making mistakes. So then not only do you have a crisis, but you have to clean up the mistakes that you're making.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real fine line there between being calm and portraying confidence, but at the same time showing empathy for people who maybe are suffering more than you are, and really acknowledging that people are worried and suffering.
Yes, I think you are staying calm, but you're responding. But when you're calm, you can read what's happening. And one of the things you're reading are the emotional cues you're getting. And that ability to recognize that and respond to that enables the other people to get calm and self-regulate themselves.
Yeah, I will, just a couple quick points. One is everybody likes transparency in concept. Transparency in practice is interesting. It can be fine at certain levels of leadership where people are taking on kind of a role where they expect to know all the risks that they face. And there are other people who join a larger organization who, in theory, like being at a startup, but when you share all the information about all the risks on an hour-by-hour basis, they kind of freak out or become paralyzed. So it's partly figuring out how you sequence what you share and how much you share with whom when you're in the middle of a crisis, because if everybody is sort of feeling the full extent of all the downside scenarios, it can be very paralyzing and you can lack the ability to have a coordinated approach, which I think is one of our values is transparency. So we've had to figure out what that means in different moments and at different stages of the company.
Yeah, great insight. So Vinit, how do organizations learn from these events and adapt going forward?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I want to start to address it by talking about why I think it's important to learn from failures to begin with. And then I'll dive into why some companies do this better than others and some of the lessons we can take away about how to do this better in our own organizations. And so failures, especially small failures, a lot of research suggests that they can reveal underlying lapses or latent errors in routines, procedures, approaches, technologies. They can kind of paint a picture about what's broken in companies before these problems matriculate up into larger crises or larger events. And so those precursor events contain a lot of information, and some research suggests that companies that pay attention to those can come out of the back end being more innovative, being more creative, taking more risks, having more strategic flexibility. And several years ago, about 10 or 12 years ago now, a colleague and I wanted to do some research and start a new line of inquiry for us into these failures and the potential benefits they might have in organizations. And we started that research of all places in the rocket launch industry. And so why rocket launches? Well, my colleague and I were really fascinated by all things space, but more importantly, in that industry, we could collect really good, reliable data going all the way back to the very first orbital launch, the very first attempt to put a payload into orbit back in the 1950s. And in a lot of other settings, failures tend to be concealed or underreported. And so in this industry, in contrast, there's a lot of national and international agencies that collect information on these launches. So we could get really reliable data about all of the successes and the failures that had occurred in that space. And when we dug into the data, we found some interesting patterns. So first, orbital launch organizations tended to learn from their experience, as we expected. The more satellites they launched into orbit, the better the chances their subsequent launches would be a success. They launched their next payload into orbit and fulfill mission objectives. But then we disaggregated that experience, that sort of learning curve experience, into past experiences with successes and with failures. And we found, interestingly and surprisingly, that it was the failures that drove performance forward in this setting. So organizations that had a history of failure wound up being much more successful in the future with their subsequent launches. And we even found that effect persisted over a much longer time frame. So in some cases, several years longer than any of the benefits of success. And so clearly in this setting and others, failures contain some useful information about what companies can do better, but not all organizations are equipped to pick up on these lessons. So, in digging into why that's the case, one category of answers involves the types of failures that companies experience, because some types of failures have been shown to be easier to learn from than others. And companies don't necessarily have full control over these experiences, but they can enact some smart structures and processes to take advantage of these opportunities when they occur. So one opportunity, again, comes through small failures. And there's this interesting paradox with small failures. So when they are small, they can reveal some of these lapses before kind of there's a massive crisis, before we have to worry about reputational damage and some of these other threats that can kind of create tunnel vision and close us down. But on the flip side, the smaller the failure, the trickier they are for companies to notice and recognize. And, one of the things that struck me about what Bryan was mentioning is how mindful he is in his company, and how, you can kind of, and as Sarah was discussing, you need to, in those situations, take a step back and be able to process that information and make sense of what's occurring, especially when it's one of these precursor events that you might not even recognize as the starting or the beginning point of a failure to start with. And there's all sorts of examples of organizations that fail to notice these precursor events. So one example, Sarah mentioned she'd done some work for NASA, and historically, with the Challenger and the Columbia shuttle disasters, each of those shuttle missions was preceded by prior shuttle missions with the exact same pattern of technical problems that led to those shuttle disasters. And the contrast was that those prior missions ended in success rather than failure. So those small precursor events just simply weren't noticed. And so what can our organizations do to get better at noticing these precursor events? One category of answers comes through research on a special class of organizations that tend to get this right and do it really well. And these are referred to as high reliability organizations, or HROs. And these are organizations that tend to exist and operate in extremely hazardous settings and hazardous environments, but have really good performance nonetheless. Examples, some healthcare organizations, some emergency response crews, naval aircraft carriers, their on-deck operations are operated according to these principles. And one principle from this line of work that I think is broadly relevant for a lot of other organizations as well is that these HROs have created a culture where they're incredibly reluctant to simplify interpretations. And what that means is whenever there's a deviation or an aberration, employees are encouraged to take a stop and take a time out and discuss and get to the underlying root causes of what occurred, and incorporate those changes going forward into what they're doing. An example of an organization that gets this right is, thankfully, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and they've created a culture within the aviation industry where pilots and other observers are encouraged to voluntarily report near misses or small lapses. And in some cases, the penalties for bad behavior will be reduced if people report these mistakes proactively. So that's one example of a change that organizations can make to pick up on the lessons from small failures. One other category of failures that I'll talk about are what I refer to as distributed failures. And I did some work about 5-7 years ago on heart surgeries in a panel of California hospitals performing a specific heart procedure. And I was specifically looking at patterns of surgical mishaps that occurred in these hospitals. And when I looked at where those surgical mishaps were occurring, I found that in hospitals where it was an individual surgeon or a small group of surgeons that was making these surgical mistakes, those hospitals understandably would dismiss those surgeons. They would lose their operating privileges, but those hospitals wouldn't go on to get much better at how they conducted this procedure in terms of patient mortality outcomes. And digging into why that was the case, I looked at the opposite situation where these failures were more spread out across multiple surgeons at these hospitals. And those hospitals couldn't pinpoint one specific node or place where this error had occurred. They couldn't get rid of individual surgeons. So instead, they had to dig a lot deeper into the underlying routines and processes. And it was those hospitals that invested in newer technology and brought how they performed these procedures up to current guidelines. And they wound up doing much better in the future or going forward. And so that's one other type of change that organizations can implement. I've talked a fair bit here, but there's other changes that companies can make, and I'm happy to dig into them through the Q&A if people are interested.
Wow, thanks for that. You make me think about the Toyota production line, where my understanding is anybody can pull the line, make the entire line stop when you see something go wrong. But in so many organizations, that's not the case. And thinking of our good colleague, Wayne has a question here about how to repair reputational damage. And it's talking about the example of Wells Fargo, which, for years they had these practices going on and nobody raised their hand and said, this is not right. Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and talk about Wayne's question about how to actually repair the damage once these failures or these crises happen. Bryan, you want to talk about an example where you've had to step into that?
Yeah, it really depends on what kind of crisis you're talking about. So I think Wayne's question relates to sort of a PR crisis or some kind of reputational damage for the brand or the company. But there are lots of types. I mean, if we take that example, for instance, we've rolled out new products or changed policies for how people can capture their cashback earnings on our platform that really wrong-footed some key constituents in our community of savers, people who like to find deals on things. And, we either had to roll those policies back in a thoughtful way, individually contacting those people whose trust we've sort of lost, or put out a press release and had a, frequently asked questions and sort of more formal damage control for our brand. There are situations like that where we learn from that, where we realize it's better to go more slowly with a new policy. It might be that there's a major fraud event, and we need to manage the damage control with our board of directors or our investors. So there are different groups of people who you have to sort of try to win back to your side, depending on the type of crisis. But I think the most difficult form of failure or crisis to repair has to do with how you handle situations internally, actually, within your company. So if you are in a meeting and you're the CEO and you have this leadership wake and you're kind of oblivious to that leadership wake, and you're very critical, or you're cross-examining people in a public setting about why something didn't go well, or you're saying things like, "I told you so, I knew that wouldn't work." Those are extremely toxic ways to operate in a creative environment, and they will cause people to clam up, not venture forward with bold ideas or take risks intellectually. They'll simply just keep their head down, and that's how you actually destroy organizations. So being able to respond to this or that external PR crisis, that's bad in the moment, but you move on, you move through it. If you do something that has kind of a silent or invisible corrosive effect, for instance, you don't have a blameless postmortem, you have a blame-oriented postmortem of the crisis, you will never get to the bottom of what happened, and you will have more crises. So I actually think we should pay as much or more attention to the internal reverberations of people who aren't self-aware as leaders, or not thinking through, haven't had coaching, don't understand how they show up in group settings, don't understand how they kind of process their own anxiety publicly. That's where I think controlling that damage, it takes, in some cases, years to rebuild that trust through sort of where people feel like they can kind of come out of their shell and participate in the wake of some kind of disaster.
Yeah, well put. Sarah, Vinit, comments on that?
Yeah. So basically, I think Bryan captured a very important point, that you're rebuilding trust externally and internally. So it's really a trust issue, and you don't want to, as Bryan talked about, erode further trust by mishandling it internally. So one needs to communicate, like, what's going to be different, and what are you taking responsibility for, and what are the changes that you're making in the organization, because, trust does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs when you see that something tangible is happening. And so one needs to continually communicate to all your stakeholders, how things are going to be different. And internally, I think that was a very important point, where you want to take accountability and teach people what are good failures and what are bad failures. Because you have to innovate, you have to allow some mistakes, but some failures are destructive. So what are the boundaries? What lines do we not cross? So that needs to be built into the culture, because you need people to innovate and improvise in turbulent situations where, you can't control everything. But they need to understand what are the lines you don't cross. Sloppy failures don't work. And so it's a learning experience, even internally, to understand some of these issues. And I think it is very important not to scapegoat. You don't accomplish anything by doing that. No one learns, everyone shuts down. but instead to coach people through the process. And if something is a huge violation of values and stuff, you have to hold people accountable, because others are watching to see what can you get away with and what will you not stand for. So once again, the leader has to be very thoughtful and mindful, and also be willing to take responsibility and acknowledge if they made a mistake, because that teaches everybody else that mistakes happen, but it's what degree of mistake and what's the level of mistake.
I can jump into, those are such excellent points. And, a lot of it comes down to trust and culture, as Bryan and Sarah were discussing. And, there are certain things I think that organizations can do to back that up as well. So there's this concept referred to as constrained improvisation, where you train people to the best that you can. And then, they're always going to encounter these unforeseen circumstances. And so you give them broader kind of operating parameters, and you give them a lot of autonomy within those operating parameters, so they can go and make these individual decisions. And you trust them, but you back it up with these constraints that Sarah's talked about here's kind of what we expect from you, but there's a broad circle that we can draw around that. But you at least have some understanding about, how to operate within those parameters. There's another kind of thing related to trust that I think some successful organizations do, and that's referred to in some kind of literatures as migrating decision-making authority. And it effectively means that there's trust. And whenever you encounter a difficult situation, it's oftentimes the people on the front lines that have the most information about what's happening in that event or that failure or that crisis. But it's rare for our organizations to trust those people and give them the broad sort of power and autonomy that they need to make critical decisions in a real-time fashion in those settings. And so some organizations will very carefully migrate authority down to those levels whenever they face a crisis or a failure. And then, on the flip side, it's also important to have some routines for drawing authority back up and to tell employees, okay, like, we've trusted you in this situation, and now kind of it's time to take a step back and to come back together as an organization. And interestingly, an example I think that makes this salient for me of organizations that do this really well are fire departments. And fire departments, the first unit or two that show up on the scene of an event, typically have incredible power and latitude to draw resources from throughout the network and bring them into that situation. And it's only much later, after more senior people arrive at the event and are briefed on it, that authority is very carefully migrated back up the chain of command. And it's a takeaway that I think would benefit a lot of organizations to be that flexible and to provide that trust, but to back it up with training and these structures and protocols for migrating authority down, but also pulling it back up.
Yeah. Does that resonate for you, Bryan?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think it's really interesting to hear examples from fire departments, surgeons, rocket ship builders. There are certain transferable habits of mind that I think you can take away from this meeting, and I'll take away. I think in the world of technology, it has specific risk factors. I mean, one of them is that a lot of the people that you work with are 25 years old. It's their first failure. They've been raised in the millennial or Gen Z. Everyone gets a trophy culture, and this is the first massive setback that they've experienced. And so you're almost parenting them through their first big failure, big public failure, which I think if you were in a different generation and say you served in the Second World War, and then you're entering the workforce in the 1950s, that was a different moment. And I think right now, culturally, and for a lot of other reasons, we employers of 22 to 30-year-olds are having to take into account the prior life experiences and kind of parenting backgrounds of a lot of our employees, and that makes it all the more important for the leader to to tailor the response to the audience.
Yeah, such a great point. So Sarah, what about, and then it mentioned a little bit, and question just for everybody, I guess, but maybe start with you, about what kind of qualities do we look for in leaders with regard to managing crises, and how can you train people to get better at it and coach people?
Yeah, so I think we've tried to lay out the complexity of the crisis situation. And also there's a pre-crisis phase, there's a crisis phase, and there's a post-crisis phase. And we've talked about how you build resilience and capacity within the organization. And Vinit and Bryan talked about the structures and the cultures. And we've also been talking about how you build capacity within the people. So in terms of when you're looking to hire people, we've also talked about how judgment is so important. Like when we talk about the issue of transparency, where you have to make a judgment, like, is this something we share or we don't? And so that requires not only cognitive or intellectual skills, your ability to read the social situation, your ability to read the political dynamics that's going on. Now we're having a lot of media attention. So you usually in organizations have the PR folks and the legal folks saying, debating this. The PR folks want to be transparent. The legal folks want to be conservative. So you need people who have multiple forms of intelligence. So obviously, competence and smarts for the task at hand, the cognitive stuff, but the emotional intelligence to handle themselves under pressure, to be empathic towards other people, the social intelligence to be able to build positive relationships with people. Because, when we talk about trust, it's all about relationships. The political intelligence to understand what are the power dynamics in this situation and who has the leverage here, and ethical intelligence, who is aware of the moral dilemmas in a situation and can make the call. So obviously, when we talk about the younger employees, these are things that one can develop and ask them to process, so what are the political issues here? What are the emotional issues? What did you notice? And then the kinds of traits that we'll look at is resilience, so what's a situation you've been in before where you showed resilience? You want people who can improvise and be innovative, who are not so afraid of failing all the time, because that would be a big problem when you're thrown in an uncertain situation. You want people who tend to be hopeful and courageous. So in a difficult situation, they don't get so down that they can't motivate themselves. They become paralyzed. People who are just competent and excellent in what they do, not because the manager is watching them, but because they pride that, they value that. People with integrity, social responsibility. So these are all the different qualities that are going to come into play in a crisis, and also I think are good for good business, even in non-crisis situations. Then in terms of training, what companies do often is they do tabletop scenarios. So you need to understand what are the range of threats. So, those of us who study crisis preparedness, we suggest prepare for one crisis in each type. So economic crisis, or what's a tech disaster for you? You may not be in the rocket business, but a cyber attack could be a big tech disaster, like a university with online classes, And then what's a human and social crisis? What would workplace violence look like? Or maybe a strike that could affect you. So one from each type, and then go through the scenarios, who would be the stakeholders? What systems do we need in place to respond to that? Then in addition, as I think others have already talked about, you have to continually build this capacity within the organization. And an organization that did that well was the Taj Hotel Group. And there are a couple of cases written on that if anyone's interested in studying that further. And I think as Vinit talked about, when you coach them in non-crisis situations. So what the Taj Group would do, firstly, they hired people with many of these qualities. So they were building resilience capacity. Then they would allow, their staff to improvise in solving customer problems. And the manager would also be on the floor. And as issues were arising, he or she would coach the more junior employee, okay, that was a great way of handling, or could you have handled this a little better? So they learned how to improvise way before they experienced this terrorist attack, where the gunman came and actually killed a number of people within the Taj Hotel in Mumbai and, in other organizations. But the interesting thing was to see how these employees responded during the terrorist attack of their hotel. They improvised. Many of them stayed on the job. There were hotel operators who stayed on the job. They didn't run away, with the terrorist attacks going on, calling guest rooms and telling them exactly what's happening and where were the terrorists located. Other employees formed chains to help guests escape, hid guests within it. There was no one micromanaging because these people were all in different rooms and different parts of the hotel. But because they had the capacity to handle stress, to handle pressure, these were people they hired who had a customer service orientation and had built such a culture. They were able to respond to the situation. So organizations can do a lot to build resilient and transformative organizations prior to a crisis. And then, as Vinit talked about, post-crisis, in terms of learning from these situations, because what are you doing? You're continuing to build your capacity.
I can jump in too if we've got a quick sec, but I think one of the themes that's come up is the importance of experience and simulating and training and kind of anticipating these events. We've kind of talked about that repeatedly. And I think from my part, nobody wants to fail and nobody wants their organizations to fail. And so the ideal is to take advantage of the experiences that we get along the way and be mindful about them, as Bryan touched on and Sarah's touched on. But also, there's some tricks and some ways that organizations can expand that experience without directly encountering these failures themselves. And so, at the start, I talked about how in the research literature, a failure is typically a shortfall against targets or aspirations. And managers and executives at some companies can set slightly challenging goals or slightly challenging aspirations or metrics in certain areas in order to give people very controlled experiences with failure to encourage that sort of creativity and innovation. They can even set up budget constraints to limit some of the downside from that. And some organizations do that really well. Another kind of big line of research is on vicarious learning and how companies learn from each other. And, it's kind of a shame that in a lot of spaces and a lot of industries, there aren't more networks and alliances and conferences and meetings to sort of share some of those experiences, even across other companies that we might be competing with, just to increase that base of knowledge and provide the customer with a better product in that setting, or to do things more efficiently. So there's all sorts of things companies can do to learn from these experiences without necessarily needing some of the downsides of them.
Yeah, really great comments. Made me think of like YPO too, which is I think a place where young folks like Bryan or leaders can share these experiences and learn from each other. Bryan, you guys came off mute there.
Yeah, no, just because I came off mute, but I agree that sharing is not only important for vicarious learning, but also for emotional support. When we had the pandemic, I organized a call every Monday morning at 9 a.m. for about what became over 100 CEOs in Colorado. And as much as anything, it was just, we're going through this, you're going through this. This is normal. If you feel this way, if you don't have an answer to this, part of the temptation when you are, especially the founder, but the CEO of a company, is that you kind of slip into playing this role of having things figured out. When you are presenting to the company, to the board, it doesn't seem like a good idea to acknowledge that you haven't, because then people might think, well, why am I following this guy? He doesn't even know what he's doing. But when you slip into that role, unfortunately, it ends up being a worse way to lead, because people can quickly figure out that you don't know exactly what's going to happen next, particularly in a pandemic. And so there's a lack of kind of vulnerability, relatability, authenticity. It's actually better to say, this is really tough. these are the steps that we're taking. These are the people that we're speaking with. They're facing these same challenges. We're doing the best we can. If you have an idea or a suggestion, we'd love to hear it. This is our problem. And, you kind of get past this founder leader as messianic survivor, leader, Moses figure who's going to lead everyone out of the desert or have a direct conversation with God and receive the next set of instructions. That's really not how it works. And we all do our bit in perpetuating that myth. I mean, look at Elon Musk. Oh, the great Elon Musk, who's just so genius. And yeah, okay. I mean, sometimes, but also there's a ton of people behind Elon Musk who work really hard to build products that matter. And I think that when you're talking about distributed systems for resilient organizations, the more single-threaded you are on the kind of heroic founder, I'd be interested in researching that, because I think that the best organizations are those where the founder does not perpetuate that myth, but instead actively undermines that and says, I don't have all the answers. We need a good idea to come from anywhere, and sort of balances that vulnerability and authenticity with confidence instilling leadership. And two, organizations where more than just the founder or the founding team or the senior leadership team are empowered to step forward with the suggestion, which we've been discussing on this call today, to pull the end and cord in the example of the automobile line, or to step forward in the example of, an idea that might save the next rocket ship and avoid groupthink. Those are the organizations that I think are going to come through those situations. But I think in technology and in entrepreneurship, it's particularly challenging because there is a tendency to kind of mythologize the people at the top of the organization, whether it's because of movies like The Social Network, or the way we talk about Steve Jobs or Zuckerberg or Musk or others, that I think does quite a bit of harm in actually charting a path forward through a real world crisis.
Really well put. You made me think of Jim Ryder, the CEO of First Bank, who, talked about when the pandemic hit, just being like, I haven't a clue how we're going to handle this, but he met with his team twice a day, and they just worked through it, as you so eloquently put there, Bryan. We don't know, but we're going to figure this out. So it makes me think a lot about the sort of the wisdom of the team, and how as a leader you can rely on that wisdom of the team. Any thoughts about that? Like how you surround yourself with the right kind of people in these situations?
It's tough. I agree with Sarah that it's part of the training process in Vinit as well. It's part of how do you model for someone how to adapt? How do you model for someone how not to catastrophize? How do you model for someone how to remain, to the extent you can, in the present moment instead of spiraling in a crisis? It's the limits of talking about it. Again, I mean, it's important to have a framework, and this research is really important. And you got to be in it, to quote the great Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Okay, great. We have a plan. We have a theory. But how you're going to react emotionally is a very, very different topic. And I think that is something that does have to be modeled and coached. Hey, Vinit, I saw that you did this, talk me through how you thought about that, or why you did it that way. What would it have looked like if you tried this? Or best of all, just modeling that. Again, I think a lot of it comes from resisting the temptation to step into the void immediately with all the answers. That is very strong temptation, especially when it's your investors and you sort of feel like this is my flock and I have to lead them out of, this perilous situation. Very hard to resist that temptation. But if you can, and sit there while other people are forced to sort of figure out what the heck to do next, you're actually contributing to their teaching and emotional development. So it's modeling, but it's also, to a degree, self-restraint.
Okay.
I also just want to quickly highlight the role of industry associations in this, because it's not, as we talked about, that it's not going to impact just that one organization. It's going to impact the industry if there's a crisis. So, like, for example, the Chemical Manufacturer Association really responded after, the Bhopal disaster in India. And they got all the organizations together, because what happens is, if there's a crisis in one organization in the industry, there's going to be regulation that's going to affect everybody else. So they wanted to get ahead on that. And so So it's not only the internal team, but there's an external team stakeholder who also has a stake in what's happening. So it's important after crisis to realize there's openness. So when you're trying to reach out to other organizations, that's a good stakeholder that could help you bring people together so you can learn, vicariously from each other's experiences.
That's a really good point. We're just about out of time. Vinit, you have any last thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to go back to something that Bryan talked about, the idea of restraint. And, I can only imagine how difficult that is in an organization with all of the pressures and the investors and kind of all of those external pressures that matter. But, from a research standpoint and kind of taking a step back and thinking about several things, that makes so much sense. And I think he said it really well. This idea that you have to be authentic as a leader, that you have to restrain yourself, that you have to trust your employees and give them some autonomy. And there's this notion that mindfulness and attention in organizations toward particular events is a limited or a scarce resource, much like the finances or the other resources that we have in an organization. And, if you're constantly directing your employees to do all sorts of things and look everywhere, and if you're criticizing them, then you really kind of create this closed down culture in an organization that, as he mentioned, can be really, really difficult to unpack. I can only imagine how difficult that must be in practice, but it's such an insightful thing that I think a lot of organizations can take away.
Well put. Well, we're going to have to close. I know several people have got meetings to move on to. Thank you so much for such a stimulating conversation. Bryan, congratulations. I can see why you've been so successful. And Sarah and Vinit, you're both legends in your field, and it's wonderful to be a colleague with you and to have you on this webinar today. Just want to alert people that we have a second in our series on multicultural business coming up. We have the Chief Diversity Officer from Comcast coming in from Washington, D.C. for an event coming up in a couple of weeks, and on the 17th of November. I hope you can come to that, and stay tuned for another Business Insights in the future. Thanks so much. And Michaela, thank you, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you.